All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, now that the primary is over, the media has actually noticed that Joe Biden might have a few electability weaknesses that he needs to shore up. Funny how no one pointed out that it might be tough to win a general with a candidate who's at zero in enthusiasm with voters under 45, until, of course, Bernie Sanders had been safely removed as a threat. Or how, maybe, just maybe, having passionate and enthusiastic supporters could be an actual electoral advantage come November rather than a terrible bad sign of a toxic campaign. And make no mistake about it, Joe's deficit with young voters is a massive problem. Currently, according to the latest Quinnipiac poll, while Trump is doing worse on net favorability with young voters at -24, he actually has a higher percentage of young voters that rate him favorably. 33% of young voters have a favorable opinion of Donald Trump, while only 30% have a favorable opinion of Joe. Let me say that again. Less than a third of voters under 34 have a positive opinion of Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden. That is an absolute catastrophe for Joe and for the Democratic Party that's so proud of being the party of young people. And make no mistake about it, the sneering contempt that all of those people had for the Sanders movement will come back to haunt them, not only in this election cycle, but in the future, as they try to build a durable majority that depends very heavily on the votes of the young. Remember that vaunted Obama coalition? It was famously heavily dependent on young voters. But now, of course, Joe swears things between him and the Bernie base are going to be different. In the letter he published after Bernie's exit became official, he wrote to Bernie supporters, "I see you, I hear you, and I understand the urgency of what it is we have to get done in this country." And if his vague reassurances didn't win you over, well, Joe's got an exciting new plan to lower the Medicare eligibility age from 65 all the way down to 60. As Jeffrey Stein over at WAPO pointed out before he deleted his tweet, this would cover only a fraction of the 30 million Americans without health insurance. More than 25 Democratic senators, including moderates, already support dropping Medicare to 55. You're doing just great with that outreach, Joe. Keep it up. Perhaps at this pace, you can get to the left of that firebrand Amy Klobuchar by the time of the virtual convention. Look, I absolutely applaud all the groups that are pushing to get meaningful commitments from Joe, like no corporate or Wall Street appointments in key positions. But let's be real. Joe Biden's not going to change. He's been in Washington for nearly 50 years. 50 years. He is who he is. If you think he's going to shift course at nearly 80 years old, then I've got a lying dog-faced pony soldier to sell you. And so let's talk about who Joe Biden really is. In a weird way, he actually bears some similarities to Donald Trump. Not on the surface level, of course. Their style and their affect is clearly quite different. But both have basically adopted a rhetorical style to appeal to the working class while in actual reality selling them out. Biden's been known in Washington simultaneously as two completely contradictory things: middle-class Joe and the senator from MBNA, a reference, of course, to the massive credit card issuer based in Delaware for whom Hunter lobbied, by the way. Joe plays the everyman very well, though. Talking about his Scranton roots, knows how to handle himself in a union hall, plain-spoken and with a whole repertoire of homespun stories about the Biden values his dad imparted to him. It's unusual and impressive, frankly, that after 50 years in Washington, he's still got the feel for it, still maintained the brand. Of course, we all know the reality of what his worldview has meant for the working class during the course of his tenure in the minority and in the majority as he climbed the ranks, earning more and more power, and finally ascended to the vice presidency of the United States. He oversaw the declining fortunes of the American middle class. He watched as their wages stagnated and their unions withered. He helped usher in the trade deals that sent their jobs overseas. He spearheaded the crime bill that disproportionately sent their sons to prison and backed the wars that disproportionately sent their children overseas to die. Alongside Obama, although they promised hope and change, they stocked up on Wall Street-friendly types, former Clintonites, so that instead of change, we just got a new look on the same old approach. Now, that's to say nothing of the way his family members personally enrich themselves with plum gigs, board seats, and influence peddling. I don't have to tell you what the results of those last 50 years were for working-class Americans, and obviously, I don't lay it all at the feet of Joe Biden. No, he had many partners in forging this reality, but never did he step out of line, and occasionally did he actually lead the charge. Trump is a different flavor of fake working class hero, but that's precisely what he is. I've written before about how outside of capturing the anger of those who had watched their communities crumble and their stability along with it, he also tapped into their accurate perception that much of this town and the national media and the leadership of both parties, frankly, sneered at them, held them in contempt, judged what they ate and where they lived, and even the words that they used. As the kid from Queens with the gaudy taste, Trump really shared that sense of grievance. Here he was, famous billionaire, and still just a tacky joke when it came to the fancy folks in Manhattan and in the Hamptons. Of course, as president, he staffed up with a bunch of typical Wall Street types, just like Biden will. Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin could easily serve under a Biden administration. Many of the people contemplated in Tom Friedman's silly unity cabinet piece could easily serve under Trump. The bipartisan corporate consensus, folks, you just love to see it. And so that's the very sad, depressing, terrible choice we're now faced with. Two people who can't be bothered to give workers anything more than some rhetorical signaling and occasional palliative care. Biden wants to lower the Medicare age a few years. Wow. Trump moderately improved NAFTA. Incredible. The righteous fires that burned after the 2008 financial collapse have somehow dimmed into these fake populists who can't help themselves from throwing cash at big business and promising that nothing will fundamentally change. But while Joe Biden might not be changing, the world is. And I can promise you this, people are not going to settle for working class branding exercise. Sagar, it really hit me, that poll, that Quinnipiac poll that showed the favorability ratings of Trump and of Biden with voters under 34. And there is, Trump gets 30% basically, Joe gets 30%, and you have another third that's like, none of the above. I don't like any of these choices. And what does that mean for the future of the Democratic Party, for the future of America, when you have such a large chunk of young voters who are like, none of this is for me. None of it.
It's what it leads to is cynicism. That's really what it is. And look, I've long criticized the Trump administration from that ground of saying that they didn't do enough of what they said they were going to do. And I think the real thing is it's going to come down to cynical and political calculation, which is actually a terrible place to be.
Yeah.
Because what it comes down to is you're like, well, some people do about 25% of what I want compared to 0% of what I want.
Right.
And then you have to do this weird value judgment shuffling around. And unfortunately, that is the way that it has had to work in kind of the neoliberal era. But it didn't always work that way. If you look at the way that politics was, the aspirational nature of not just how people used to campaign, but how people used to govern. And we used to do big things. We used to have big programs. We used to do great things across the world and for ourselves. And a lot of that was lost in the last 40 years. And I think that is what leads to a real malaise amongst the general population. Because what's happening with the young is actually what's happened to the largest group of voters in this country, which is non-voters, which is that right now, it's Chris Arnotti's book, and what he talks about this is that the largest group that we have are people who don't vote because they have absolutely no faith in the political system. These are disproportionately people who are lower middle class or lower class, who don't make any money, who view any connection to the government as a hassle in and of itself. Forms and all these other things are just tools in order to keep them where they are. And so they just have no faith in the system. And unfortunately, I think for people who are under 35, like myself, a lot of it just comes down to you become a very cynical person whenever you look at politics. And you have to reach back very far in our history to actually see where some hope really lies for a transformative future, because in your living memory, it doesn't exist.
Well, it does exist. It existed in the form of the Bernie Sanders campaign. I mean, for young people, overwhelmingly, that was the person who actually gave them some hope that their priorities and interests could be represented in government, which is why it's such a tough time right now, because they're looking around and going, I don't know who the next logical successor is. I don't know what the next thing is that could actually give me hope in participating in the electoral system. And you have no choice. There is no other choice but to have to participate in the system if you want to make it better. And so I think a lot of people are struggling to see what that next right move is, which is what makes it so tough. But, those numbers that we're seeing, that level of sort of disgust, that's even before we really have the full fallout from what we're living through right now. I mean, that's numbers that reflect an economy that was, it was doing great for the very wealthy, and it was doing okay. Wages were going up a tiny bit. Unemployment was low, at least official unemployment. So those are numbers that reflect a, relatively good time. What is that going to look like, especially for people who are just coming of voting age now, who are in college right now, who are graduating right now into 30% unemployment, and their whole life trajectory being thrown off course by what is happening and the failure to respond to it in Washington, D.C. right now? I don't think we know what that looks like. I don't think we know what that kind of dissatisfaction and disaffection looks like. We have the Occupy Wall Street model. We have all these activist movements that have cropped up. But I think this is going to be something like we've never seen before.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party thinks they can take young voters for granted because they think that they don't have another choice. And young voters do tend to be progressive on most issues. I mean, it is the most progressive generation, but they don't identify with the Democratic Party. They don't have that reflexive Democratic Party, like I'm just going to go and vote blue. And they don't listen to the legacy media. They're not getting fed their daily dose of propaganda from CNN, MSNBC, et cetera.
Well, this is the future of politics, and as I've always said. And actually, you're right. Young people are progressive on economic issues. Cultural issues is actually basically split. So, when you say in terms of the Bernie Sanders campaign.
I don't know about that.
No, if you look at abortion, on immigration, everybody's basically split.
Not on things like gay marriage.
No,
not on things like drug legalization.
That's what, Trump is. So saying if you look at this in terms of the future of politics and the fault lines, I wouldn't say that it was embodied in the Sanders campaign. And at the same time, he failed twice. So this is somebody who failed to challenge in order to fight against that political establishment 2 times. So it only feeds the cynicism of what I'm talking about. And in terms of what you're saying, yeah, it's going to be a lagging indicator. And the lagging indicator was Occupy Wall Street. Took 3 years ultimately to materialize because the fallout, because people still have hope. People will be like, oh, they're coming for me, they're coming for me, and they're coming for me. It takes a long time to realize that that's actually not going to happen. So that's what I've said. We called this from the very beginning, which is that it's going to take 3 years. People won't even know what hit them in the face because anger bubbles and bubbles and bubbles, and it ultimately comes to the point of a real reckoning in our politics where it will make Trump and Bernie look like pretty circuses compared to what is to come. I know. You can read history and you know what is coming. Well, and people don't care.
Also, right now, people are just trying to get through the day. They're trying to live and deal with the crisis. You're just so inundated. And that was the timeline for Occupy Wall Street. It was a little bit of a lag, as you said, after you've had a chance to pick your head up and look around and go, my God, they transformed America in exactly the wrong direction. And I'm not just going to sit here and stand it.
Right.
I'm going to get out there and I'm going to do what I can to change this course and make my voice heard. And so I think that is going to be small. It's going to be a blip on the radar compared to what could be coming.
Yeah, I think that's right.
All right, Sagar, looking forward to your radar. That's next.